It was a heinous, horrific, purposeful murder that was senseless and not needed.
Breaking news, the bodies of 2 young girls buried in shallow pits and suitcases were discovered in Cleveland, Ohio. At present, the police have confirmed that the 2 girls are half-sisters. On the afternoon of March 2nd, the police received a report from a dog walker stating that a body was suspected to have been found in the suitcase. The investigators immediately rushed to the scene. After conducting a search in the nearby area, they discovered another shallow pit with a suitcase containing another body. Subsequently, personnel from the forensic office rushed to the scene and took away the bodies of the 2 deceased for further examination. Both victims were young women, one estimated to be between the ages of 8.5 and 13, and the other between the ages of 10.5 and 14. At present, the cause of death of the 2 deceased cannot be determined.
At this time, we don't know how long the juveniles had been at this location. It was some time, so it's not just something that was recent.
At the same time, the police are conducting inspections throughout the state and received assistance from state, federal, and local partners. The authorities urge residents in the area to review their own surveillance footage.
Welcome to Global Crime Fact. Today we're uncovering the disturbing story behind the shocking Cleveland murder case after 2 children found in suitcases. If you follow real crime investigations and want the truth behind the headlines, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us continue bringing you powerful true crime stories from around the world. On a quiet afternoon in Cleveland, a man walked his dog through an open field near a high school. It was the kind of ordinary moment no one ever expects to become the beginning of a homicide investigation. The wind moved softly through the grass. Cars passed in the distance. Students had walked through that same area countless times before. Nothing about the scene seemed unusual. But suddenly the dog stopped. At first the man assumed it had caught the scent of something buried in the soil. Dogs do that sometimes. They dig, sniff, and move on. But this time the animal refused to move. It kept pawing at the ground, scratching harder and harder at the dirt. The man looked closer. Something was buried there. At first, he could only see a corner of dark material sticking out of the soil. He brushed away some dirt with his shoe, expecting to uncover trash or maybe an old bag someone had dumped there. Instead, he saw the zipper of a suitcase. The suitcase looked old and dirty, partially buried beneath the ground as if someone had tried to hide it. Curious and slightly uneasy, the man pulled at it, dragging the suitcase out of the shallow hole where it had been hidden. He hesitated for a moment. Something about the situation felt wrong. Then he opened it. What he saw inside would trigger one of the most disturbing homicide investigations Cleveland had seen in years. Because inside that suitcase were human remains. Police were called immediately. Within minutes, officers arrived and quickly secured the field. What started as a simple walk through a quiet neighborhood had suddenly turned into an active crime scene. Investigators carefully examined the suitcase and the surrounding area. At first, they believed they had discovered a single victim. But as detectives began searching the field more thoroughly, they noticed something else nearby. Another patch of disturbed soil. Officers moved closer and began digging. What they uncovered next made the situation far more horrifying. A second suitcase, buried roughly 25 feet away from the first. When investigators opened that suitcase, they realized the truth about what they had stumbled upon. This was not one victim. It was 2. And both appeared to be children. The quiet field near Ginn Academy in Cleveland's South Collinwood neighborhood was suddenly surrounded by police tape. Crime scene units worked through the evening, documenting every detail, every footprint, every possible piece of evidence that might explain what had happened there. But investigators were facing a terrifying mystery. Who were the victims? How long had they been buried in that field? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, who would do something like this to 2 young children? As detectives began the difficult process of identifying the victims, the story only grew darker. Because when the names of the two girls were finally confirmed, investigators realized something that would shock the entire community. The person they would soon arrest for the murders was someone the girls knew. Someone who had been responsible for their care. Someone who had lived with them. Their own mother. But as police continued piecing together what happened to 8-year-old Mila Chatman and 10-year-old Amor Wilson, another heartbreaking truth began to emerge. For years, someone had been trying desperately to find one of those girls. A father who said he had spent 5 years searching, asking courts for help, trying to track down where his daughter was living. A father who now says he only learned the truth when investigators contacted him with devastating news. His daughter was gone, and the place where her body was found was closer than he ever imagined. What investigators would uncover next would raise painful questions. Questions about custody battles. Questions about missed warnings. And questions about whether this tragedy could have been prevented. Because behind the discovery of those two suitcases buried in a quiet Cleveland field lies a story that is still unfolding. One that investigators say is both shocking and deeply tragic. And the deeper authorities dig into the case, the more disturbing the timeline becomes. The timeline of what may have happened inside the home where the two girls once lived. And the timeline that may reveal exactly how this terrible crime came to light. The discovery of the two suitcases in that quiet Cleveland field immediately launched an intense investigation. Detectives knew they were looking at a case that would require patience, precision, and time. The remains found inside the suitcases were badly decomposed, and at that moment, investigators had no names, no clear timeline, and no idea who the children were. What they did know was that someone had gone to great lengths to hide the bodies. Crime scene investigators carefully photographed the area around the shallow graves. The suitcases had been buried roughly 25 feet apart, suggesting that whoever placed them there had returned to the same spot more than once or had deliberately spaced them apart. The soil looked recently disturbed, though it was difficult to determine exactly when the suitcases had been buried. Police sealed off the field near Ginn Academy in Cleveland's South Collinwood neighborhood. Yellow tape stretched across the grass, while investigators worked methodically under the gray afternoon sky. Officers canvassed nearby homes and businesses, knocking on doors and asking residents if they had seen anything unusual in the area over the past weeks or months. But no one seemed to know anything. For the people who lived nearby, the news spread quickly and quietly at first. A police presence in the neighborhood always attracts attention. Residents stood on porches or watched from their windows as investigators moved through the field wearing gloves and protective gear. Soon the rumors began. Someone said a suitcase had been found. Another neighbor claimed police had discovered something worse. Within hours, local news crews began arriving at the scene. Reporters stood just beyond the police tape, speaking into cameras while trying to piece together what had happened. But at that point, even investigators were still trying to understand what they were dealing with. The remains found in the suitcases appeared to belong to children. That alone made the case far more urgent and emotionally heavy for the officers involved. Homicide detectives began working closely with the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's office to determine the identities of the victims. Because without names, solving the case would be far more difficult. The suitcases were transported carefully to the medical examiner's facility. There, forensic specialists began the delicate process of examining the remains. The condition of the bodies suggested they had been there for some time, though investigators were cautious about releasing any details publicly while the examination continued. Detectives also began searching missing persons databases across Ohio and beyond. They looked for reports involving missing children who might match the approximate ages of the victims. but early searches did not immediately provide answers. That uncertainty made the situation even more troubling. In many cases involving missing children, there are reports filed by family members, schools, or neighbors. Someone usually notices when a child disappears. But in this situation, there seemed to be silence. Days passed as investigators worked around the clock. Every small detail mattered. Forensic teams collected soil samples from the burial site. They analyzed the suitcases themselves, looking for fingerprints, fibers, or any trace evidence that might reveal who had handled them. Meanwhile, detectives continued knocking on doors in the surrounding neighborhood. Had anyone seen someone digging in that field? Had anyone noticed someone carrying large suitcases near the area late at night? So far, nothing concrete had surfaced. The investigation began shifting toward forensic identification. Since the bodies were badly decomposed, traditional identification methods were limited. That meant DNA testing would likely be the most reliable way to determine who the children were. Samples were taken and sent for analysis. While investigators waited for results, police leaders held brief press conferences asking the public for help. They described the discovery in careful language, avoiding unnecessary details while emphasizing the seriousness of the case. Cleveland Police Chief Dorothy Todd addressed reporters, calling the situation heartbreaking and urging anyone with information to come forward. Behind the scenes, detectives continued building timelines. They began reviewing surveillance cameras in the surrounding area, schools, businesses, traffic cameras. And nearby homes sometimes capture movements people never realize are being recorded. Investigators hope that somewhere, somehow, a camera might have captured someone carrying or transporting the suitcases. But those reviews take time. While the investigation continued, forensic scientists made a breakthrough. DNA testing confirmed the identities of the victims. The two children were 10-year-old Amor Wilson and 8-year-old Mila Chatman. The girls were half-sisters. When investigators learned their names, the case suddenly shifted from an unknown tragedy to something far more personal. Now detectives could begin tracing the girls' lives, where they lived, who cared for them, and when they were last seen. But another troubling discovery emerged almost immediately. Authorities struggled to determine when the girls had last been seen alive. There were no recent missing persons alerts that had captured widespread attention. No recent news reports about two sisters vanishing from their home. That raised an unsettling possibility. Had the girls been missing longer than anyone realized? Detectives began examining records connected to the family. They looked at school enrollment data, welfare records, and previous addresses associated with the girls and their relatives. That process led investigators toward someone who had been responsible for the children. Their mother, 28-year-old Aliyah Henderson. At first, investigators approached the situation cautiously. Being a parent of the victims did not automatically make someone a suspect, but in cases involving children, family members are often among the first people detectives speak with while trying to understand what happened. Police began gathering background information about Henderson. They examined past addresses and reviewed records that might reveal where she and the girls had been living. Detectives also tried to determine who had last seen the children and when. During this stage of the investigation, something else happened that would add a deeply emotional layer to the case. One of the girls' fathers learned about the discovery. Ginn Academy, the father of Mila Chatman, had been searching for his daughter for years. He had not seen Mila since 2020, when she was just 3 years old. Over time, he said he had repeatedly tried to locate her and pursue custody through legal channels. But he struggled to find where the girls were living. When investigators finally contacted him, the news they delivered was devastating. His daughter had been found, but not in the way any parent would ever hope. Chatman later described the moment he learned the truth. After years of searching and trying to reconnect with his daughter, the confirmation of her death was something he could barely process. He spoke about Mila as a joyful child, someone who loved the color pink and imagined herself as a princess. According to him, she was always smiling, always full of energy, the kind of child who brightened every room she entered. Now, investigators were trying to understand how that little girl had ended up inside a suitcase buried in a field. For detectives working the case, the timeline surrounding the girls' lives became increasingly important. When was the last time anyone outside the family saw them? Were they attending school regularly? Did neighbors remember seeing them playing outside? Each answer would help investigators narrow down when the tragedy may have occurred. While those questions were still being explored, detectives made a crucial move. They located Aliyah Henderson. Officers brought her in for questioning as investigators continued examining the evidence gathered from the crime scene and forensic testing. At the same time, police conducted a search of a residence connected to the investigation. Inside the home, they discovered something unexpected. Another child was present. Authorities reported that the child appeared to be in good health, but due to the seriousness of the investigation, the child was immediately placed into the care of the Department of Children and Family Services while detectives continued their work. For investigators, that discovery added urgency to the situation. They needed to understand what had happened to Mila and Amor, and whether there were any other risks to children connected to the household. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued analyzing the evidence recovered from the suitcases and the burial site. Detectives compared timelines, reviewed interviews, and examined digital records that might reveal movements, communications, or locations tied to the investigation. Eventually, detectives believed they had gathered enough evidence to take the next step. On Wednesday evening, police detained Aliyah Henderson. By the following day, authorities formally charged her with 2 counts of aggravated murder in connection with the deaths of Mila Chatman and Amor Wilson. The announcement sent shockwaves through the Cleveland community. The idea that a mother could be accused of killing her own children is something that shakes people deeply. For neighbors who had unknowingly lived near the place where the suitcases were buried, the reality of what had happened was almost impossible to comprehend. But despite the arrest, many questions remained unanswered. Investigators had identified the victims. They had charged a suspect. But one crucial piece of the puzzle was still missing. Authorities had not yet revealed how the girls died. And until that question was answered, the full story of what happened to Mila Chatman and Amor Wilson would remain incomplete. As detectives continued building the case, the focus shifted toward understanding the final days of the 2 sisters, the timeline that would ultimately reveal how their lives ended and how their bodies ended up buried in that quiet Cleveland field. And the deeper investigators dug into that timeline, the more disturbing the picture became. The arrest of Aliyah Henderson brought a new wave of attention to the investigation, but for detectives working the case, the job was far from over. Charging a suspect was only the beginning. Now investigators had to answer the many questions that still hung over the deaths of 8-year-old Mila Chatman and her 10-year-old half-sister Amor Wilson. The most important question remained unanswered. What exactly had happened to the girls? And just as troubling, when had it happened? Inside police headquarters, detectives began reconstructing the timeline of the sisters' lives. Every investigation involving children depends heavily on understanding their routines, where they went to school, who saw them regularly, when they were last seen by people outside the household. But as detectives began pulling together those details, the timeline quickly became complicated. Records suggested that Mila and Amor had not been seen publicly for quite some time. In many cases involving missing children, schools or daycare providers notice when a child suddenly stops showing up. Attendance records, teachers, and neighbors often become early warning signs. But here there appear to be gaps. Detectives began contacting schools in the area, trying to determine whether the girls had been enrolled recently. They also looked into housing records, attempting to track where Aliyah Henderson and the children had been living over the past several years. Meanwhile, investigators continued interviewing people who had known the family. Friends, acquaintances, former neighbors, anyone who might help fill in the missing pieces. Some people told detectives they had not seen the girls in a long time. Others said they had only seen them briefly and had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. But as the investigation continued, one voice stood out among the rest. The voice of Mila's father. Ginn Chatman had spent years trying to stay connected to his daughter. According to him, his relationship with Henderson had been brief. The two were never married, but they had lived together for about a year after Mila was born. During those early years, Chatman said he saw his daughter regularly. He described her as energetic, joyful, and full of personality. She loved pink. She believed she was a princess. And she had a smile that could brighten an entire room. But over time, circumstances changed. Chatman said his contact with Mila became more limited. Eventually, he stopped seeing her altogether. The last time he saw his daughter was in 2020. She was only 3 years old. At first, Chatman believed the situation might be temporary. Custody arrangements can be complicated, and many parents go through periods where they struggle to maintain regular contact. But months passed, then years. During that time, Chatman said he tried repeatedly to find out where his daughter was living. He filed requests for emergency custody through the courts. He contacted child welfare agencies, hoping they might be able to help locate her. But there was a major obstacle. He did not know where Henderson and the children had moved. Without a confirmed address, his efforts often hit dead ends. As the years went by, the search became more frustrating. Chatman later said he felt like he was chasing shadows, always trying to catch up to information that seemed just out of reach. Then in early March of 2026, everything changed. Police contacted him. At first, he may have believed they had finally located Mila. After 5 years of searching, perhaps this was the moment he had been waiting for. But the news detectives delivered was devastating. They told him his daughter had been found. Her remains had been discovered inside a suitcase buried in a field. For Chatman, the weight of those words was almost impossible to process. The years he had spent searching suddenly collapsed into a single moment of unbearable grief. He later spoke publicly about what Mila had meant to him. She was happy-go-lucky, he said. She was always smiling. Friends and reporters listened as he described the little girl he remembered, a child who loved to imagine herself as royalty, who believed the world was full of possibilities. Now that world had been taken away from her. Even more painful was another discovery that investigators shared with him. Mila had been living much closer than he realized. The home connected to the investigation was located within view of the field where the suitcases had been buried. For years, the place where Mila's life ended had been just a short distance away from where she had been living. That realization only deepened the grief and frustration Chatman felt. "I feel useless," he later said. "I couldn't save my baby." For detectives, his statements added another layer of complexity to the case. Custody battles and family disputes can sometimes reveal warning signs or past conflicts that help investigators understand what might have led to a tragedy. But the timeline still remained unclear. When had the girls died? How long had their bodies been buried in that field? And why had no one outside the immediate household noticed their absence sooner? Meanwhile, investigators continued analyzing the physical evidence recovered from the suitcases and burial site. Forensic specialists carefully examined the luggage itself. Suitcases can contain important clues, fibers, hair, fingerprints, or traces of where they were purchased. Detectives also examined soil samples from the burial site. Sometimes the layers of dirt or plant growth can offer clues about how long something has been buried. While those tests continued, the medical examiner's office worked to determine the cause of death. But that process was complicated by the condition of the remains. Authorities were cautious about releasing information publicly. In many homicide investigations, premature details can compromise the case or influence potential witnesses. Still, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The deaths of the two sisters were not random. Whoever placed their bodies inside those suitcases had attempted to hide the crime. And now detectives were trying to determine exactly when that crime had occurred. As the investigation unfolded, another important development took place in the community. News of the case had spread rapidly across Cleveland. The discovery of two young girls buried in suitcases shocked residents and left many people searching for ways to honor the victims. A vigil was organized near the location where the suitcases had been discovered. People gathered quietly in the evening, holding candles and placing flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes in memory of Mila and Amor. Children from the neighborhood attended alongside parents and community members. Some people had never met the girls, but the tragedy touched them deeply. Two young lives had ended in a way that no one could understand. As the candles flickered in the evening air, people stood silently, reflecting on the fragility of life and the pain of loss. Back at police headquarters, detectives continued their work. With Henderson now facing 2 counts of aggravated murder, prosecutors began reviewing the evidence collected so far. Preparing a case of this magnitude requires building a clear and convincing timeline that explains what happened and why. But the investigation was still unfolding. Detectives continued interviewing witnesses and analyzing forensic evidence. They examined digital records, phone data, and any communications that might reveal more about the days and weeks leading up to the tragedy. Meanwhile, Henderson appeared in court for her initial hearing. During that hearing, a judge set her bond at $2 million. The charges against her were severe, and prosecutors argued that the seriousness of the allegations justified a high bond amount. For the families involved, the courtroom proceedings marked the beginning of a long legal journey. Justice in cases like this often takes time. But even with the arrest and charges filed, investigators still faced the same haunting question they had asked from the beginning. What happened to Mila Chatman and Amor Wilson? Somewhere within the evidence, interviews, and forensic reports, the answer existed. And as detectives continued piecing together the final days of the sisters' lives, they hoped the truth would eventually emerge. Because behind the police reports and courtroom hearings were 2 children whose stories deserved to be fully understood. And until every detail of their final moments was uncovered, the investigation into the Cleveland suitcase murders was far from over. As the investigation moved forward, detectives began focusing on the most difficult part of the case, reconstructing what had happened inside the home where the 2 girls had been living. The discovery of the suitcases had revealed where the bodies ended up, but it did not explain how the tragedy began. For investigators, every homicide case eventually comes down to a timeline. When were the victims last seen alive? What happened during the hours, days, or weeks that followed? And what evidence remains that can help explain those missing pieces? In the case of Mila Chatman and Amor Wilson, detectives knew that the answers were likely hidden within the routines of daily life, the quiet details that often go unnoticed until tragedy forces people to look back. Investigators examined the residence connected to Aliyah Henderson carefully. Homes can hold important clues even long after an incident has taken place. Every room, every object, every surface may contain traces that help investigators understand what happened. Forensic teams photographed the interior of the home and collected potential evidence. They examined items such as bedding, clothing, and household surfaces, looking for anything that might reveal signs of violence or disturbance. At the same time, detectives continued conducting interviews with people who had interacted with the family. Neighbors were asked if they had noticed unusual activity. Had anyone heard arguments or disturbances? Had anyone seen the girls playing outside in recent months? Some neighbors struggled to remember details. Life moves quickly in residential neighborhoods, and people often keep to themselves. Many said they had not paid close attention to who lived in the nearby houses. Others told investigators they had occasionally seen children around the area, but could not say exactly when. Those small uncertainties made the timeline more difficult to piece together. Meanwhile, investigators were also reviewing digital evidence. Modern investigations often rely on technology to fill gaps in memory. Cell phone records, location data, and communication histories can sometimes reveal movements or interactions that witnesses may not recall. Detectives examined phone records connected to the case, looking for patterns in communication. They reviewed dates, messages, and calls that might provide insight into the events leading up to the girls' deaths. But even with digital records and forensic testing, one major question remained unresolved. Authorities had not publicly confirmed how Mila and Amor died. The Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office continued its work, conducting examinations and analyzing evidence to determine the cause and manner of death. In cases involving decomposed remains, that process can take time. Investigators must rely on careful analysis of bones, tissues, and any surrounding evidence to understand what happened. Until those results were finalized, detectives and prosecutors were cautious about revealing details. At the same time, the legal process against Aliyah Henderson was beginning to move forward. The charges filed against her were severe, 2 counts of aggravated murder. Prosecutors indicated that they believed the evidence gathered so far supported those charges, but the investigation itself was still active. During early court proceedings, Henderson appeared before a judge who reviewed the allegations and set her bond at $2 million. The high bond reflected the seriousness of the accusations and the concern for public safety. For the families connected to the case, the courtroom hearings were only the beginning of a long and painful process. For Mila's father, Deshaun Chatman, the legal developments did little to ease the grief he felt. The loss of his daughter was something that could not be measured in court documents or legal arguments. What remained for him were memories. He continued to speak publicly about the child he remembered, the little girl who loved pink and believed she was a princess. In interviews, he described how she would smile constantly and how she brought joy to everyone around her. Those memories now stood in stark contrast to the circumstances surrounding her death. For many people following the case, Chatman's story raised difficult questions about whether more could have been done to prevent the tragedy. He had said that he spent years trying to find his daughter. He had reached out to courts and agencies seeking custody. But without knowing where Mila and her family were living, his efforts had been limited. The investigation into the deaths of Mila Chatman and Amor Wilson continued to raise painful questions about how situations like this can unfold unnoticed. Meanwhile, detectives remained focused on the evidence. Every interview, every forensic test, every piece of data had the potential to reveal something important. Homicide investigations often take months or even years to fully resolve. But each small discovery moves investigators closer to understanding the truth. Back in the South Collinwood neighborhood, life slowly began returning to its usual rhythm. The police tape had been removed from the field near Ginn Academy, but the memory of what had been discovered there lingered. For residents who had watched the investigation unfold, the field would never feel quite the same. It had become the place where two young lives were discovered. Community members continued to leave flowers and small memorials in honor of the girls. Stuffed animals and candles appeared near the location where the suitcases had been found, quiet reminders of the lives that had been lost. For many people, the tragedy was difficult to comprehend. Children represent innocence and possibility. When harm comes to them, it shakes communities in a way few other events can. As investigators continued building the case, prosecutors began preparing for the legal proceedings that would eventually follow. A trial, if it occurs, would likely involve testimony from detectives, forensic specialists, and witnesses who could help explain the evidence gathered during the investigation. But the legal process takes time, and until the full details of the case are presented in court, many aspects of what happened to the two sisters remain part of an ongoing investigation. What is known is that two young girls lost their lives. Their names were Mila Chatman and Amor Wilson. They were 8 and 10 years old. They were sisters. Their story began with a quiet walk through a Cleveland field and the discovery of 2 buried suitcases. That moment uncovered a tragedy that investigators and families are still trying to fully understand. For those who knew the girls, the loss is immeasurable. For the community, the case serves as a painful reminder of the importance of protecting children and ensuring that warning signs are never ignored. And for investigators working the case, the mission remains the same as it was from the moment the suitcases were opened: to uncover the truth, to ensure that every detail of what happened is understood, and to seek justice for 2 young sisters whose lives ended far too soon.